So welcome to the Lovefly podcast. It's Paul Tizzard here. I am the host of this podcast and I've been a fearofflying coach now for approximately 25 years. So welcome. And today I'm going to be talking to myself because I thought I would talk to you a little bit about head work, which if you're familiar with the change burger from episode 69, you all know what I'm talking about, but if not, doesn't matter because I'm going to talk a little bit more about thoughts, but I'm just going to put a different spin on it. So welcome. One of the things I want to talk about is just get you thinking about thoughts, and you might want to make some notes of this. I'm going to run through some patterns that this is very much in the sort of helpful and unhelpful thought process area, because quite often when you look at this, it's quite easy to just sort of get stuck on all the different cognitive behavioral therapy techniques and say, well, you know, there's 20 different unhelpful thinking patterns. But the reality is, it doesn't really matter whether you can name them. It's actually about whether it's helpful or unhelpful. So before we get into that, let's just sort of look at it, why we perhaps do that type of thing, where we have our brain throws up all this stuff that may or may not be useful to us. It feels like our brain is almost working against us sometimes. I don't know if you can relate to that. But if you look at it logically, our brain is a don't get eaten machine. So it has evolved over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and to be able to keep us alive, and it's one of its purposes. And there's lots of ways that you can complicate this by talking about all the different things that go on, and I could start talking about the amygdala, you know, some people call it the danger radar and all the rest of it, which all that stuff is great, but it can get very, very confusing once you start talking about that. And the reality is that you arrive with your brain, and what we've been trying to do as humans for the last hundreds and hundreds of years, probably longer, is to reverse engineer how does my brain actually work. And so over the last, particularly the last 15 years, I'd say that there's been some significant changes in what we understand about the brain, but still there's a lot we don't understand. So I'm going to stop there. Just going to say, let's just keep it really basic. Your brain is there and it's evolved to keep you alive, and most of the stuff that it does is automatic. And one of those things about keeping alive, so if you think about it really logically, and I know I talk about this in the book as well, like automatically you're going to be fearful of things you don't understand or you're not sure of. So you think there's a really good evolutionary benefit to this. So to be slightly anxious about things that are happening that you don't understand, has kept us alive as a race. So you can see we're wired to do this type of stuff, and therefore it's unlikely in our lifetimes that we're going to turn that thing off. You know, it's just, that's the way we're wired. That's just the way it is. Not much you can do about it. So what can be done is actually to think about, how do I live with that? What's the trick? How do I actually make the most of this bit of software, this bit of kit that I've got that I don't really know I don't really understand how it works. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But what do I do about this? I've got these thoughts going on. So we're just going to be looking at what I'd say head work, and I thought we would go through a bunch of unhelpful thought patterns. I have blogged about these, but I just thought it'd be quite nice to bring it to life a bit with some examples. Now, the idea behind the change burger, so a burger you eat from the outside in, don't you? So if you eat a burger, there's a bun on the top and then there's some sort of filling in the middle, whatever that is, whether it's meat or vegan or whatever you've got, but it's a filling. And if the filling represents the desired outcome, where you want to get to, how you want to feel, then if we only look at that bit in the middle and just, I want to feel safe, I want to feel confident, I want to love flying and all the rest of it, that's of course possible, but it might take a little bit longer And what if you don't feel safe and you don't feel comfortable? And what if you don't love flying? Then what? Do you just give up? Well, clearly not. So the outside-in approach, same way you'd eat a burger, is that as you munch into a burger, you're going in from the outside, but it's all connected. So eventually it's all going to end up in the same place. And that's the way to look at this. So the top bun represents head stuff, head work, and the bottom bun represents your body. So what do you physically do? So when you have a fear, or when you are doing something that you're worried about, not only do you have the thoughts, the feelings, but also your body will react in a certain way. So in the book, I often talk about acting as if, so moving your body in a way which is if you were relaxed. Because if you move it in a way which is when you're fearful, all you're doing is triggering those automatic behaviours, thoughts, feelings that you know all too well. So that's just a quick sort of dip into the body part. So we're just sticking with the head work. And one of the models that's quite often useful, and quite a few of the podcasts have talked about this, is using some sort of cognitive restructuring technique. So there's lots of names for these different things out there. But let's just say we're going to look at your thoughts. And it's not about controlling them, because you can't. They come in, they go out, there's millions of them just bombing around your head all the time, like I say, like an internal chatterbox. So the thought of actually controlling them is not probably helpful. So if we just classify them and start to notice them, we might, if we're lucky, be able to spot helpful and unhelpful thoughts. And these thoughts tend to be triggered by things. So we call it sometimes people call it the ABC model, where you have an activating event, so something that happens. So for example, I often give the thing like you have a bing bong in the aircraft, and if you don't know what that means, then your beliefs about what that could be. So bing bong could mean, certain death. It's a secret message from the pilots to the crew. That's it. So I'm being a bit light-hearted here, but if you believe that to be true, because you don't know any different, then the consequences, how you felt and what you did, would obviously be very logical to what you believe is actually happening to you. So there's obviously something going on here that we could perhaps interrupt, and we'll get onto that. So you might want to just pause for a moment and think about what the activating events might be for you, when you're on board an aircraft, or maybe it's just the thought of even booking a flight or walking to the airport, seeing aircraft flying overhead. There's all sorts of things that could be your activators. And the reason I say that is because people just say it just comes upon me, or it just happens, or I just don't like flying, or I just know I won't be safe, or I just... I always feel claustrophobic. And see, these things sound like they're kind of automatic. So they call them negative automatic thoughts. But actually, we can become conscious of them. Even if we can't control them, we can start to notice the things that we're doing. And I often say this to people who say to me, I'm claustrophobic. And I say, how do you know when to be claustrophobic? And they'll look at me like, well, what a stupid question that is. Well, but it's not the same for everybody. So it's an individual thing. And all the research time and time again is suggesting this, that your fear is completely individual to you. It has its own design, its own makeup. You've created it through, events outside your control, things that have just happened. It's just started. Some of you know exactly why it started. Others, it's just crept up on you like a big surprise. Thanks very much. But here it is. It's going on. It's cracking off in your head. You've got these things in your thoughts going around. You're thinking, oh my goodness, what's all this about? Where do these come from? But there is a process, but it's just we sometimes have to sort of slow ourselves down a bit and just start to notice and be curious. How do I know when to be scared? I know it sounds like a really weird question, but how do I know when to be scared? Oh, I just am. It's not good enough. Because so if I'm thinking about my work, I'm not scared of flying, which you'd be pleased to know, but I have had to overcome other things, and, standing up in front of people and speaking, which I do now, and I love it, was not always the way. And I'm aware that when I go and do something which is new, that I have to overcome these fears. I feel them almost gripping me, like almost like a wall to walk through. And almost it's almost stopped me. And occasionally I have not done stuff and thought, I know if I'm honest with myself that there was some fear thing going on there, but I've justified it, rationalised it away, which we do, don't we, as humans? Yeah, well, I wasn't just in the mood, I didn't really want to do it today. Why do I need to do that type of thing? I'm happy as I am. And people have said that to me as well. They'll rationalise fear away and say, well, I don't really need to fly. We weren't made to fly, were we? I mean, look at it. If I was meant to fly, I'd be a bird. And if I had $1 for every time someone said that, I'd have about $7. So not much. And one of the things I'll say about this is that actually it's really easy to talk ourselves into and out of anything. That's the great thing as a human. But quite often we'll be aware that we know that was probably a fear response and I've just let it run riot in my head. So we just want to slow it down a bit and kind of notice, what am I doing? Is it helpful? Do I want to keep doing that? So we don't always know what the triggers are. We don't always know kind of how to stop it. But we can. So this thing now is just a chance to look at something called thinking traps. And these undermine what we want to achieve. They're normally quite brief. They are usually negative. And mostly they're outside of our awareness. There's a whole bunch of them I'm going to go through. So I've got 12 that I'm going to talk through now. And I'll try and give some examples that are related to fear of flying. As best I can, but I'd just like you to listen for a moment. So if you're not driving or anything, you could write 1 to 12 and then you can just sort of notice, do you do any of these? And then we'll talk about some ideas around what you can do about that, some simple ideas, because you can't turn these things off, by the way, but you can do a couple of other things which people have told me have been helpful. So let's get going. So the first one, no surprise, is called catastrophizing. This is when we imagine the worst possible thing is about to happen and we predict that we won't be able to cope with the outcome. The imagined worst case scenario usually never happens, and even if it did, we'd most likely to cope with it. And this is like, imagining the worst, I don't need to fill this one in for you, but running a movie in your head, imagining the worst case scenario ever. That's what catastrophizing is. So you're not just on a flight and it's not going to go well. It'll be horrendous turbulence and it's just going to be like throwing us around and I won't be able to cope. So that's catastrophizing. You really take it to the nth degree. So there is one that's a bit similar to this. I'll try not to sort of like creep into that one, but it's like imagining the worst is going to happen and that we've got the least resources to deal with it. That would be what catastrophizing is. And one of the things I used to say about this, catastrophizing is a bit like, excuse this is an old joke, so have you heard it before? But you've got glass half full, glass half empty. Catastrophizing is, why are we talking about a glass? Because somebody's probably stolen it anyway. That's catastrophizing. The worst possible thinking. So all or nothing thinking. This is when we look at situations in terms of extremes. Things are either good or bad, a success or a failure, but in reality, most events call for a more moderate explanation. For example, failing keeps your diet does not mean you have failed, you've had a small setback. So I bet a lot of you can relate to this one. Anything less than perfect is a failure. So people who've been on the 30-day program I've run or have done the webinar or have been listening to the podcast, they get on a flight and they say, do you know what, I haven't flown for 20 years, I got on the flight and then I cried on takeoff. I just feel like it's all gone backwards. And I say, well, that's unfortunately an example of all or nothing thinking. There's no way you're going to be perfect straight away, because beating a fear is a process and it's little by little by little, so don't beat yourselves up. That's what I want to say. it's okay not to be perfect. Give yourself permission not to be perfect. So I always say with beating fear of flying that you'll go 3 steps forward, 2 steps back sometimes, and that's just all okay. So that's what that was. So all or nothing thinking is that one. So anything less than perfect means I'm a failure. You're not, but that's the thinking trap. Next one, fortune telling. Being able to predict the future. I just know I won't be able to cope. I know I'll mess up. I'll never be able to manage my anxiety. Now you don't know that, but you're predicting the future. And this is what the fortune telling is. So it's being able to predict that things will just turn out badly. And the reality is we can't predict the future, can we? But that is fortune telling. Next, mind reading. This trap happens when we believe that we know what others are thinking and we are assuming that they are thinking something that isn't possible. So I know that the cabin crew thought I was stupid because, I was a bit upset. Or they all couldn't tell that I wasn't okay and they were all thinking I was a failure or I was just like a fool for not being sort of braver. Now, you may be right, you might be right, but you might not be. So it's about what's more helpful to think of. Is that can you absolutely guarantee that that's what they're thinking or doing or knowing? No, you can't. Next, I love this one, right, by the way. Overgeneralization. This is when we use words like the following: always, never, etc. to describe situational events. I'll give you a few more in a sec. This type of thinking is not helpful because it does not take all situations or events into account. So, for example, whenever you find yourself, I always, I never, everyone, no one, everything, nothing. I always have bad flights. I'll never be a happy flyer. No one can help me. Everything goes wrong on my flights. Nothing can be done. So these words, so if I was listening to you as a coach, I'd be playing these back in a sort of an annoying way, in sort of tilting my head like coaches do. Really? Always? What? Never? You got to do it like that, in that annoying voice. Because what you're trying to do is reflect back. Is that true? What? You'll always be a nervous flyer? Were you born a nervous flyer? No. So you can't always be a nervous flyer if you weren't born one, were you? But I know it's really smug and easy to say that. And this is not about that. This is about you being able to notice, what am I doing? What are my automatic patterns that I'm doing? Because once you notice it, it loses its power. So that was overgeneralization. Some of these overlap a little bit, but it is what it is. Labeling. This is when we talk to ourselves in really mean ways. We use a negative terms to describe ourselves. I'm stupid, I'm a loser, I failed, I'm rubbish, I'm just so bad, I'm just so rubbish, I'm a terrible person, I've really let everyone else down. I've let myself down. So quite often if you were to pause and listen to your own thoughts, if you had a friend that spoke to you the way you speak to yourself in your head, they would not be a friend. You'd drop them. You'd ghost them. Do you know what I mean? But the way we talk to ourselves sometimes, and the way we'll describe ourselves, I'm so stupid, I'm such an idiot. Is it helpful? So that's labeling. So like I said, if you had a friend that spoke to you like that, they would not be a friend. Be gone. Next one's called demands, and this is an interesting one because I do hear this sometimes, but it's very hard to notice this. So this is when you tell yourself that you should, must, or ought to feel or behave in a certain way. So the result is that you're constantly anxious and disappointed with yourself and or with others around you. I should never feel anxious. I must control my feelings. So whenever you use must, should, have to, need to, these thoughts are where we're actually holding ourselves up and saying, I'm making a demand of myself. And I have to ask, is that reasonable? So if I should be over this fear by now. I must be okay when I fly. And what this does is it puts us under massive pressure. And so we have to sort of look at that and say, is that helpful? Now this one is a little bit like catastrophizing, but it has its own separate category, which is called magnifying versus minimizing. So magnifying on the negatives in a situation and minimizing the positives rather than seeing a balanced whole picture. So I went on a flight, it was awful, and it just, I didn't do well. But then when you actually think about it, and quite often we have to do this later because at the time we might say, well, do you know what, I was all right for the takeoff and the landing, and normally I'd be really upset. And most of the cruise I was fine. So it's we get a little bit of a distorted picture about ourselves. So that's what happens. So maybe you recognise that you've done that or could be prone to that one. By the way, we're all prone to these. All of these thinking traps, all of us are prone to. And it's not just about fearful flies. These are just general. Mostly we don't notice these, but the critical thing is, and I'll keep coming back to this, is noticing. Even if you start to notice a couple of them, then you can kind of go, oh, I'm doing that thing again. And it takes its power away. And this again, there's a slight overlap. This one's called tunnel vision. So this one happens when we only pay attention to the bad things that happen, but ignore all the good things. So it helps us, it prevents us actually from looking at all the aspects of a situation and drawing a more sort of balanced conclusion. So it could be like, in my world, if I did a presentation and it actually went fine, but I remember there was one person that scowled throughout it. That's what I focused in on, and I don't see anything else. And so I start to see that nobody else has enjoyed it. And it's a bit like, when I do a presentation, if you get some feedback forms and 99 people said they enjoyed it and one said I hated it, I hated you and I'll never come back, which one would you dwell on? And that's tunnel vision. So it's a completely normal thing, not helpful, but normal. This one I don't know how to apply to fear of flying, but I'll give it a go. So it's called personalization. So it's when you literally taking things personally, so assuming responsibility when it's not yours. So maybe this will be, perhaps this is the one which I describe as stand-in pilot, when you're on board an aircraft and you're there, your job's to concentrate and keep it in the air. Do you remember that one from the book? It's a bit like that, I think, where you're on duty, just in case the pilot needs you, in case he or she's got a bit of a tough spot. Pop out into the cabin and say, Carol, you couldn't help us, could you? I know you're in charge of keeping the aircraft in the air today. Any tips? Any sort of, anything you'd like to offer? Of course, I'm joking, and hopefully you know by now that I use humour because I think that you are normal people. You are normal. You just have got into some unhelpful habits like we all do in different ways. So that's why I'm taking the mick a bit, but I mean it with heart. Honest. But yes, and maybe that's an example of personalization. So a bit like stand-in pilot, that it is your responsibility, and perhaps when things don't go well, it's all down to you. Maybe it's that one. I'm not so sure on this one. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that I can make a strong link here for fear of flying, but I've done my best. Externalization. So you focus on, I get it now. This is the opposite. So now I've actually remembered this. So personalization is what you take responsibility for everything. Everything's your fault, so everyone was upset with your family when you flew. The flight was bad because everything was bad. The whole holiday, it was all your fault. Okay, externalization is the exact opposite. So it's when we blame everything on everybody else. Well, I wouldn't have had a fear of flying if it wasn't for my parents. They've passed it on to me. Thanks very much. What a gift. where you can't see that anything happened. So the ground staff were really rude to me. They made me angry. The cabin crew were extremely unhelpful, and that's why I got nervous. Well, that's putting all the power with them. That's what externalization is. So is that reasonable to put it all with everybody else, or is it possible that some of that's yours as well, but not all of it? So I love this one actually. This is the last one. This is called emotional reasoning, which I don't think is a great name for it, but I'll describe it as it's written. So emotional reasoning is a cognitive process by which a person concludes that his or her emotional reaction proves something is true, regardless of the observed evidence. It's a bit like, I feel, therefore it is. I feel bad, therefore it is bad. I feel scared, therefore this is a bad situation. I feel sick and shaky, therefore I'm about to have a panic attack. I feel unsafe. I feel scared, therefore it is a scary situation. So we're taking one set of things and then naturally moving on. So people will say this to me, it's not really covered by this, but the physiological stuff. So sometimes if you're particularly motion sensitive, you'll take that as a sign of it meaning something more than it is. If your stomach feels a bit unsettled, or you've noticed you get a little bit of butterflies when you fly, you might interpret that as meaning something else, that actually that your gut instinct is telling you and you're in danger. So it could be linked to that as well. So those are the 12. So just think for a moment. Hopefully I went through those and gave you enough of a description that you can perhaps identify yourself. And what I want to say straight away, whilst you're sort of like thinking, oh, well, I've ticked all 12, is that you are normal, okay? We all do all of these at different times. Because it's not just nervous flyers that get the privilege of doing these thinking traps. We all do them. I just wanted to show you that actually it's okay. You know, these are normal things. But if we just pull back a bit from this, we can actually then start to challenge these and thinking this. These thoughts that I'm having, are they helpful or unhelpful? So one of the things that quite often people do is use a few of these techniques. So I'm going to read out some questions. Please write these down and think about this. This is called disputing, okay? And the thing I'll come back to, I'll conclude in a second, but these are called thinking traps, and they are completely normal. We all do all of these, but what we're going to do is a technique called disputing. So it's a little bit like the ABC that I did before. So A is the activating event, B is the beliefs about it, C is the consequential behaviours that you would have logically. So D is for disputing. So asking yourself a question. I'll give you the questions now. All right, and then E is effective outlook. So this has come from REBT, which sounds like a Rita Franklin song, not meant to, Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy. And this just takes it on a little bit further and just says, actually, you can dispute these things. You can stop yourself. So some people will talk about just noticing. Oh, I've noticed I've done that thing again. I've noticed I'm overgeneralizing again. I've done that thing again. And that is enough for some people just to notice it. But for others, you might want to do something a bit more active. Now, you can't change, you can't stop those thoughts, but you can do something different with them. Because remember, as I've always said, thoughts are not facts, are they? Thoughts are not facts. They are electrical impulses in your head, moving around at a rate of knots. Okay? They're not facts unless you decide they are. So disputing goes like this. Remember the A, B, C, D, E? A, activating event, B, beliefs, C, consequence, D, disputing, E, effective outlook. So here's some disputing questions. What are the chances that that will actually happen? What is the worst that can happen, and how likely is that? Am I right to think that, weighing up the evidence, that this is true? So what evidence do I have that this is true? What evidence do I have that I'm in peril? I've heard the bing bongs. Don't like it. I'm looking around now to try and find evidence to support what I think is true, that this is actually a bad thing. The cabin crew are rushing past because they've just run out of chicken and beef. But what evidence do I actually have that I'm in any peril? And what is this costing me? And is it worth it? I love that one. What is this fear costing me? And is it worth it? I really like that question, actually. So what are the chances that this will happen? What's the worst that can happen if it's true? Am I right to think that? Weighing up the evidence. What evidence do I have? And what is this costing me? And is it worth it? So sometimes when we look at these thinking traps, it might be just a case of interrogating them. Why am I doing that? Be curious. To be able to do this, it helps you to problem solve, and you might think, well, what would be a more helpful way to think about this? So just because I feel uncomfortable doesn't mean I'm uncomfortable, because these thinking errors are common. They call them thinking traps because we all do them. So the key thing is awareness and monitoring, noticing. I've noticed I'm doing that thing again. And if you do notice them, you will notice that because it's like the change burger, everything affects everything else. Thoughts affect feelings, affect your body affects your feelings, affects your thoughts. They're all affected. It's one same system. So there may be some truth sometimes in the interpretations, or I don't feel very comfortable what's going on, but quite often it might not be the case. And so just noticing and being curious, what am I doing and how helpful is this for me? And being able to do that, being curious, means that then we can keeps us in our rational part of our brain, and rather the scared primeval part which doesn't know. That bit that we always had since we've been cave people. So when cave people would look up and see things that he, she, prefer not to say, didn't understand, they would have been scared. Would have been scared of the dark. Because in the dark is scary stuff. So we learn to grow out of it as we get older, but it doesn't mean we're comfortable. And you only have to walk down a dark alley at night and you'll notice the hairs go up on the back of your neck. You become hyper alert. So even though you might be saying, oh, yes, I'm fine, and you whistle loudly to show you're a brave person, but part of your brain is very activated and alert. These are primeval things. They're just, you can't turn them off. So noticing what we're doing and just sort of going, that's a part of my brain trying to keep me safe. Thanks very much, brain, but I've got this. Just being able to notice these things is massively, massively helpful. I just managed to knock a big glass of water all over myself as I was accentuating my point, which all of it is wasted because it's on a podcast anyway. So I'm completely soaked right now, but not that you care. And it's a sign. It's a sign. No, it's not a sign. It's just soaked. I'm just soaked. It's just water. I'll be okay. I don't know what I'm going to do about the floor because water is such a pain on carpet, isn't it? I suppose I should stop the podcast and soak up the water. I'm hoping that's been helpful. I hope that by going through those things that you can start to notice your own patterns and that you are in fact normal. And if you need any further help, remember we've got the Lovefly Facebook group if you're not in that already. There's things that you can do, practical things you can invest in. Most of the stuff you can get from the podcast. A lot of people I've been speaking to recently have just been able to fly much better just by listening to the podcast. But if you need a little bit more help, we do have the 30-day program and the on-demand webinar, which are on the website lovefly.co.uk should you need them. That's just for information's sake anyway. But like I say, most people get what they need from the podcast, which is fantastic and very rewarding for all of us at Lovefly. So thanks ever so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Until then, take care.